Last month marked the first month since December 1992 that a car, not a truck, was the country's top-selling vehicle. The cars we're buying today are more fuel efficiency. There is now a shortage of batteries for today's hybrid cars. And indeed, the wait lists for the fuel-efficient vehicles is increasing, while the difficulty in giving away the fuel-inefficient vehicles is making real problems for the industry. We're beginning to look at mass transit, and indeed, Americans are taking more mass transit and driving less. In fact, Americans drove 11 billion fewer miles in March compared to a year earlier. We all recognize that there is real distress in my home state of Michigan. Plants closing, workers laid off, and production is being curtailed with all kinds of consequences to our economy and to our society. Many people blame the automobile manufacturers for these woes, and I won't deny that they've made their share of mistakes. But those who are most critical of the auto industry often forget one thing. For many years, in order to stay in business, our automobile manufacturers have given the American public exactly what they wanted. As was said in a recent column by Walt Kelly, the legendary author of the Pogo comic strip, we have met the enemy, and he is us. No one ever has forced the American consumer to buy an SUV. What pulled the American consumer towards larger, less efficient vehicles can be summed up in two words: cheap gas. And the consequences were that the natural instincts of Americans to drive in more prestigious, larger, more comfortable vehicles took over. There is going to be an adjustment. What has happened is behind us. But what is now before us is to confront reality. And it has significantly impacted the effort of American automobile makers and automobile workers and manufacturers around the world to improve fuel economy. A critical part of the race is going to be development of electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids. Like many of you, I was pleased with last week's announcement that the Chevy Volt is on track for a 2010 launch. Good news. But there are lots of things that we need to do, and we must do to promote the development and deployment of this and other new technologies, not the least of which is to note that the solution of our energy problems lies not in one technology, but in a broad mix of many. We also have to recognize our need to encourage this new technology. Last year, Majority Leader Hoyer and I wrote a bill and a law to encourage this new technology. But we do have limits. Congress can pass any law it wants, but we can't repeal two very important laws: the law of supply and demand, and the laws of physics, to which we are committed to obey whether we like it or not. If the Chevy Volt proves, and I hope it does, to be commercially viable and technologically feasible, meaning that its cost is not astronomical and its batteries are workable, it won't be because elected officials or bureaucrats have done something special. It will be because of our talented engineers and scientists, and that they have made something which appeals to the American consuming public. But here again, we must learn from our past. The idea of plug-in hybrids is not new. As Atlantic Monthly reports in its current issue, a bright young engineer at General Motors came up with the idea in the 1990s. But at the same time, the company, like all of the automakers, and I hope you're listening to this, was struggling on how to meet a mandate Congress placed upon that company and the industry in the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. The language of the legislation called for zero-emission vehicles. and a plug-in hybrid using small engines to generate electricity was not a zero-emission vehicle, although it was probably better in terms of meeting the needs, desires, and demands of the American consuming public. You can feel free to interrupt with applause anytime you're minded. The company needed to devote its resources to a zero-emission vehicle, which I might note it ultimately developed, but which I think we could all agree did not meet our needs as nicely or as well as does this kind of vehicle that we now discuss. With the zero-emission mandate, Congress effectively legislated that the perfect should be the enemy of good. And that's a mistake I don't want to replicate again. If the Chevy Volt does prove viable, and I hope and I think that it does and will, motor vehicles will become the first sector to solve its carbon problem. In fact, today, though admittedly flawed, the CAFE system is going to be something which is going to continue to regulate the industry, and it will be the only industry that operates under a carbon constraint. As for the other sectors of our economy that emit greenhouse gases, let me say this: we're going to get you next. In that vein, Energy and Commerce Committee is working to prepare legislation to establish an economy-wide program to limit greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. The cornerstone of that program will probably be a cap-and-trade system. As we cap and trade, and as we craft this legislation, we're going to give careful consideration as to how the electric utility industry is going to be affected. And I want to say parenthetically, I'm telling my friends in industry, all industries, we're going to write a bill when we get to it, and when we get an understanding of all the questions that we confront as we write this, that will, first of all, be a bill that industry will hate. But I'm telling industry, we're going to try and see to it that as we do this, it's a bill with which you can live. Because the importance of this is the difference between a viable economy and a decent standard of living and a way of life for our people, and something far worse.